I thought I would say a few words about the Institute as it has just passed its first birthday, from the perspective both as a board member, which I was from the outset last April, and more recently as the Chief Executive. Then I thought I'd tackle a few myths that have grown up around the apprenticeship reforms, and then finally I'll say a few words about the future. So, the Institute first of all. Well, in January of last year, the IfA didn't exist, and according to the Cabinet Office external assurance review that was going on at the time, it was 6 months behind schedule, with 3 months to go. There was no board in place. The organisation had a handful of staff camping in the basement of the Department for Business, and questions were being asked during the passage of the Technical Education Bill as to whether the IfA would be ready on time. By the end of February, 1 month later, the Institute had secured its own office space, ICT services, and was onboarding staff. The size of the organisation was around 40 people at launch, rising to a full complement of 86 by August, and by October, the Institute was fully operational, had a digital management information system, had its own website, and a set of values. And the Civil Service People Survey for last year yielded a staff engagement score of 70%, putting it in the top 10% of all civil service organisations alongside the Treasury and the Cabinet Office. The IfA also had a new board, which went through its induction process in March last year, 13 days ahead of its launch, and that board largely consists of employers from a range of backgrounds, private and public, small and large, from finance, manufacturing, engineering, and some representing the FE sector and independent training providers too. And we'd also recruited around 100 or so industry experts onto our root panels, and those root panels are highlighted in the back of the anthology today. So, what's the Institute's role in this wider apprenticeships reform? Well, our mission is to improve access to high-quality apprenticeships and technical education in order to transform the skills landscape. That's my mission. I wrote it. When I came in, we just had a series of tasks, but I wanted to firstly give the Institute a purpose, and secondly a context, and the context is important because it's about transforming the skills landscape. This remit is both enabling and regulatory. Enabling in the sense of helping employer groups to develop quality apprenticeship standards and assessment plans, and regulatory by ensuring that these standards and assessment plans meet the agreed quality criteria to be funded. And if you look at the words in the mission, improving access is not just about improving access for potential apprentices and for employers, but also for those minority groups or those from socially disadvantaged backgrounds being able to access the opportunities that apprenticeships offer. The Institute also provides oversight of the provision of quality assurance of the delivery of the apprenticeships endpoint assessments, and actually provides that quality assurance of the delivery of apprenticeship endpoint assessments where employer groups have been unable to propose other arrangements. And we do that by contracting out the latter function. And finally, we make recommendations, and I make the point, make recommendations to ministers on what funding band should be allocated to a standard. What we're not responsible for is for the broader apprenticeships policy, the levy and the rules surrounding the levy, all of which sit with the Department for Education. Similarly, responsibility for marketing of apprenticeships to both employers and potential apprentices, the operation of the digital apprenticeship service and digital accounts, the register of approved training providers and assessment organisations, and indeed the payment of training providers is all the responsibility of the Education and Skills Funding Agency. So it's quite a complex landscape, and that's before we look at the roles of Ofsted, the QAA, Ofqual, and all of the other regulators that operate in this space. But I hope I've given you a feel for how the Institute has developed over its first year and how it fits into this landscape. I'm happy to answer more detailed questions during the question and answer panel later. I suspect that you will have picked up some headlines about apprenticeships that might colour your opinions, so I thought I'd spend a few minutes now busting some myths and giving you some facts. And let's start with the potentially gloomiest subject, starts. So, like all good myths, there's some element of truth in this, in that the number of starts since April last year has fallen when measured against previous years. But this headline figure obfuscates the long-term government strategy to raise the quality bar by moving away from a programme of concentrated so tightly on a very small number of frameworks, largely at lower levels, delivered in high volumes with some very worrying reports of little or no training, and instead move to a much richer programme with high quality standards, designed by employers for employers, delivered across a much broader range of levels and occupations. This slide shows what actually happened to starts in 2017. 2017 starts are shown by the bars, and the equivalent starts from the previous year, 2016, are showed by the dots. And it is clear that there was a rush of starts on level 2 and level 3 framework apprenticeships, the old apprenticeships, in the first 4 months of 2017, before the Institute came into being, before the levy was introduced, and most importantly, before the requirement for 20% off-the-job training was fed into the funding rules. And we recognise this was almost certainly an attempt to get ahead of the rules on 20% off-the-job training, and also the 10% co-investment required by those non-levy payers. So a rush on starts on frameworks, and I think also that there was a fear out there that some of the frameworks are being turned off, and if they didn't get people onto these frameworks quickly, then they would lose the opportunity. After April, there was a very significant fall, a fall of around 70% in starts on frameworks, whilst at the same time there was an accelerated rise in starts on standards, which is currently running at 800% up on the previous year, 800% increase in starts on standards. As the data matures and the lag in reporting of starts is taken into account, the actual overall fall in starts in this period is much smaller than originally reported. The original reports in the press were of a 60% drop. Since then, there's been talk of a 40% drop. Actually, we think the figures are down by about 28%, and even that figure is falling as we get more data. It's probably more likely to be down around 25%. This chart shows the apprenticeship starts broken down by starts on frameworks, which are shown in the top graph, and starts on standards in the bottom. And these are cumulative starts, so what you're interested in here is the gradient to see the trend. And what you can clearly see is there is a surge in the number of starts on standards over the year, and a plateauing of starts on frameworks. A year ago, starts on standards represented 3% of all starts. That figure now is approaching 40% of all starts. The table on the right shows the increased proportions of people starting on higher level apprenticeships at levels 3, 4, 5 and 6, and separated out by standards and frameworks. And frameworks, you can see, are largely concentrated at level 2 and 3. 95% of all starts on frameworks at level 2 and 3. And what you see in standards is a much broader range of starts across the higher levels, which is exactly what the reforms are aimed at achieving. So of the 88 employers that the National Apprenticeship Service Account Managers collated feedback from last month, 2/3 of them responded that their demand for standards was increasing and describing medium growth intentions. The key messages in the employer feedback are that standards are the preferred choice and they will move to them wherever available, and that the experience of using standards is positive. For example, this month, a large defence technology company told us that training staff were initially sceptical, but have now found the standards to offer a much more flexibility and are better for attaining the level of quality and competence that they're looking for. So what do we conclude from this? Well, a key element of the apprenticeship reforms programme was to put employers in the driving seat, to define what they needed, and these charts show that levy payers are keen to use their levy funds on what they regard as higher quality apprenticeships across a much broader range of levels, and that yield better outcomes in terms of upskilling for apprentices and for the wider workforce. It was always the plan to transition over time away from frameworks and towards standards, concluding by 2020 when the last frameworks will be funded. So, despite the negative headlines about drops in starts, when you look beneath the headline and you see what's actually happening, it's the reform programming that is delivering on its objective. Moving on, the next myth: it's far too difficult to get a standard approved. Again, no myth is complete without some element of the truth. And the processes we inherited when we started on this role were quite bureaucratic and designed for a different approval structure, one conducted by officials within the ministry. But as you've heard, we started improving standards from day one when we had about 40 staff, and so there was little latitude or capacity for us to amend or streamline those processes early on. And I know that led to some frustrations. But it was also the case that there were some concessions on quality and price that had been made early on in the reforms to give them some momentum. When the Institute was set up, indeed at our first board meeting, our board took a much harder line on concessions, and this has caused some employers difficulties too, particularly on the use of expensive on-the-job assessment qualifications and their expectations around funding. But it was also clear to us that we needed to speed up the process and make it easier for Trailblazers. So we did a lot of analysis towards the end of last year to see where delays were occurring. We found that on average around 70% of the time taken to get a standard approved was spent with Trailblazers. So no matter what we did internally to speed things up, in the remaining 30% of the time, the real gains were to be made in helping Trailblazers to get their proposals, standards and assessment plans right first time, to reduce the iteration and the recycling that added so much time and frustration. This slide summarises the measures we took. I'll just skim the surface. At the initial proposal stage, the major focus is on improving the occupation and getting the detail of that occupation right. Because if that's right, it is much easier then to define the knowledge, skills and behaviours required in the standard. The standard almost falls out of the occupation if you get that right. We were being very strict to avoid any overlap between standards, to avoid proliferation. And we've now accepted that there will be a degree of overlap in some standards, so we're taking a slightly softer line on overlap between standards. We've refined the guidance on qualifications, though this is not a really major change in policy, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. We've introduced a new funding process, with initial funding bands being allocated to a successful proposal to prevent Trailblazers having to provide a lot of funding information up front before they'd really developed their standard and before they really had all the information to hand. And we plan now to take the final funding band recommendation for approval alongside the assessment plan and thus cut out one cycle of approval as well. The new web-based guidance and templates are far more intuitive and asking for the right necessary detail at the right stage. And what we've done is made sure that as Trailblazers are entering this information, if they enter the information and complete it, they should have entered all the information required. They shouldn't have to have any supplementary questions, and they shouldn't be asked for more detail. This structured approach helps Trailblazers to approach the problem in a more logical and systematic fashion. It also helps to bring Trailblazers together where there are disagreements across the Trailblazer group. Finally, we now manage all of this information using a new digital tracking system, so we have visibility of all the standards in the pipeline and we can intervene if they're delayed. As well as streamlining the process for new standards, I'm seeking to apply these lean techniques wherever possible to the 280 or so standards that are currently in development now. I've also asked the team to start to prioritise these based on their maturity, their level of maturity and their readiness, and provisionally allocate them to route panel dates and funding committee approval and funding committee dates, so that we can make best use of the time and introduce some more momentum in the approvals process. There are now over 250 standards approved for delivery. That figure, I think, will shortly be 260, and it's rising at a rate of about 15 to 20 every month. By the end of this year, I predict we'll have a total of around 400 standards approved for delivery, and that figure should be well over 500 by the April 2020. We've set ourselves an internal performance target of over 80% of all new standards to be approved within 8 months of the first proposal being accepted, and that figure is currently over a year. What can we conclude? Well, it's clearly getting easier to get a new standard approved, and the piloting we've done on the new forms and with the new techniques has raised some very positive feedback from the Trailblazers who've been involved in it. And the reason sometimes given by employers who have yet to begin to use their levy funds or to take on new apprentices that it's all somehow too difficult to either to find a standard or to develop a new one is looking increasingly unsustainable and probably won't bear scrutiny for much longer. Myth 3. We've relaxed our policy on qualifications in apprenticeships. I think actually that's slightly overhyping what we've done. It's more of a refinement which will allow for more purely off-the-job qualifications, i.e. qualifications that are aligned to the off-the-job element of the training, whilst at the same time we've tightened up on the job MVQ type qualifications. Why? Because these latter duplicate the endpoint assessment and can add excessive cost to the apprenticeship. The former don't do either. The new approach allows for more nuanced and sophisticated approach to the inclusion of qualifications in apprenticeship to meet different employers' needs. And where previously degree apprenticeships were not treated in line with the mandatory qualifications policy, going forward, the same criteria will apply to any new proposals for degree apprenticeships. That is, where there is not a regulatory requirement for the degree qualification within the apprenticeship, or the degree is required for professional registration, or any candidate or apprentice would be sifted out of a recruitment for such an occupation without a degree, then the degree will not be mandatory within the apprenticeship. But it's really important to understand that this doesn't prevent the apprentice or their employer paying the small additional cost required to obtain the degree themselves, where the syllabus of the degree has largely been delivered within the apprenticeship. Myth 4. There are huge numbers of apprentices out there who will reach endpoint assessment with no assessment organisation available to deliver their assessment. 173 standards have at least one endpoint assessment organisation in place. So there are a number of standards that don't have an EPAO in place at the moment. But the vast majority of these cases, the standards either have no learners on them or are longer standards where the EPA is several years in the future. In fact, 98.6% of apprentices are on a standard with at least one EPAO in place. And of the apprentices who are due to finish, i.e. to take their endpoint assessment in the next 12 months, 99.1% of them are on a standard with at least one endpoint assessment organisation in place. So that very small number, 0.9%, who are on a standard which doesn't have an EPAO in place, are across 8 standards, and in each case ourselves and the Education and Skills Funding Agency are working with prospective assessment organisations to put that in place in a timely manner. We know that assessment organisations don't want to be on the register of endpoint assessment organisations too far in advance of actually providing the EPA, because they don't want to invest in the development of an EPA materials several years before they will ever be used or they will ever see a return on that investment. But there is a vibrant market in this area and quite a competitive one, and I'm confident that a shortfall in endpoint assessment organisations is not a barrier to progress in the apprenticeships reforms. This is not something that keeps me awake at night. The Institute is using funding band recommendations to artificially manipulate start numbers in different sectors or different levels. The IfA makes funding band recommendations to the Department for Education. Ministers there take the decision on which band each new apprenticeship should be placed into. At the moment, there are 15 funding bands, which range from £1,500 up to £27,000. DfE is currently reviewing that structure, and it may change it sometime next week perhaps, or shortly thereafter. But to make these recommendations, the IfA looks at a range of factors, including the price paid for related frameworks and delivery quotes sent in by providers. The aim is to arrive at a value for money recommendation which enables the standard to be delivered with high quality training, but without overpaying or creating scope for huge profit to be made by providers. In a perfectly performing market, we wouldn't need funding band recommendations at all. Employers would be seeking best value for money for their levy funds, and the provider market would be sufficiently competitive to offer them the choice. But neither of those conditions apply at the moment. Some employers are simply trying to use their levy funds and may not be seeking the same value from this training as they do from other aspects of their supply chain. And the provider market is still adapting to the shift from frameworks to standards, and so there isn't necessarily all of the competition we would like to see. But the Institute applies the same costing criteria to all standards, regardless of sector or level. We don't favour FE over HE, we don't favour one sector over another, for example. And we have recently implemented some changes as part of the Better and Faster to speed up how we do this in response to employer feedback. This includes the initial funding band I talked about, along with the approved proposal, and then taking that final funding band recommendation together with the assessment plan. And this is entirely in response to feedback we've had from Trailblazers that the information we were asking for at the indicative funding stage was too detailed and wasn't readily available to them. And finally, DfE has recently asked us to review a sample of the old funding bands, the ones that are already in existence and have been for some time, those that were priced before the IfA was created, using our new funding approach, and to advise on where these should sit in any new funding band structure. Enough on myths. What's next for the Institute? Well, the period between now and the summer is critical for us. Service improvement work that I talked about, faster and better work, is being rolled out, and Trailblazers, I'm sure, will see a higher quality and more consistent service, enabling new standards to be approved more quickly. By summer, we plan to have this fully digitised, again further improving user experience and generating substantial process improvements internally in the Institute. We'll also need to use this period to start to conduct reviews into the stock of existing standards, where some of them have been going now for a number of years, some of them up to 3 years, and we know that there were some price and quality compromises made early on to get some of the momentum into these reforms. We've also been asked by ministers to review a selection of funding bands for some of those early standards, as I said, using the new funding methodology. This period is also critical, though, because we will be gearing up for our new technical education responsibilities too. We've now begun hiring new dedicated staff for this, and we'll see the staff of the Institute almost doubling in the next 6 months, and an increase in complexity as we take on both procurement and contract management functions to the existing curricula and development work. And although technical education is still in its design phase, it's very clear that by taking a similar approach to apprenticeships, i.e. deriving their content from and standards for these qualifications using the same employer input that we use for apprenticeships, this will have a major impact not only on the employer's recognition of those qualifications, and there are some 13,000 of these qualifications at the moment out there, many of which mean little or nothing to employers, but also on the level 3 qualification landscape itself. I think you'll see a significant reduction and downscaling in the number of qualifications available, from thousands down to fewer than 100, but each of those being very focused on one of the 15 routes and some of the pathways within it. So if you think we've seen a lot of change so far, we haven't seen anything yet. And the last thing we would wish to do is to start those T-levels, the first 3 that are due to come online, on the wrong footing and get T-levels a bad reputation. In a sense, apprenticeships are something people know about and are comfortable with. T-levels are something that are completely new. No one's heard of them before. No one really understands what they do. So we need to deliver them successfully from the outset. And I think the timeline for the delivery of the initial 3 pathways is tight. There's little contingency left in there for any problems. And we are working with the project team and the DFE to see what we can do to mitigate this. In conclusion, I hope this gives you a flavour of what the Institute's been up to in its first 10 months and what it plans to achieve moving forward over the next year or so.